Hey guys, hey, this is Anne-Marie and this is the Anti-HR channel, and welcome to a story time. In this video, I'm going to tell you a little story that I hope illustrates why you should not be afraid to be fired, why being fired is not necessarily going to be the worst thing that ever happened to you, and sometimes it can be the best thing that ever happened to you, and why, if you are miserable in a job and you're worried about being fired, maybe what you need to do is quit. And don't think you have to give them a whole lot of notice to do it. I often think about Joanne Reid, and you guys know who Joanne Reid is. I'm a big fan of Joanne Reid. But Joanne Reid used to be the host of a very popular show called The Reid Out on msnbc before she was summarily fired. And I recently watched an interview where she talked about how blindsided she was by the experience. But right now, Joanne Reid is, on, she has her own channel on YouTube. I highly recommend you subscribe. It's pretty great. And she's been doing a lot of, interviews and doing a lot of political commentary. And, I follow her on Threads. I follow her on Instagram. And she is, unleashed. She's untethered now. She is unbossed. She can say what she really thinks about things. She can really get into a lot of subjects that she probably couldn't get into when she was an employee of MSNBC. So in a lot of ways, being fired turned out to be a really great thing for Joanne Reid. And so that's an example, before we get into my experience, of why I think it's important to understand that being fired is not necessarily a bad thing. Right? It could be something that you can really leverage and turn into something that benefits you. You just have to think about it in the right way. We are in a world, especially if you live in the United States, where you have been conditioned to be afraid to be fired. And they want you to be afraid to be fired because that means you'll stay and take whatever your manager, your company dishes out, especially now. I think there's a concerted effort to keep people discombobulated and afraid. And this translates also into workplaces. But I want to just say to you that being fired is not the worst thing that can ever happen. And sometimes it can be the best thing that ever happened. Just in my personal experience, every single time, and I've only ever been fired from a job, actually, honestly, once in my life. But it turned out to be one of the best things that could have ever happened to me, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. And I have up and quit jobs more than one time because I was lucky enough to have a mom who taught me very early on that I didn't need to stay in a job and that I should never stay in a job and allow myself to be mistreated or disrespected. And so when I was 20, I probably was 19 or 20, and I was working as a customer service agent, I guess it was definitely a customer service representative for a newspaper. And it was my job to answer calls for people who, were having issues with their delivery or wanted to stop their delivery because they're going on vacation, people who lived in the town for part of the year, was in South Florida, and needed to stop their delivery. But it was a very stressful job because the people who oversaw the customer service agents made it a stressful job. And they were timing you by how long you were on the phone with people. And I was not used to doing that. I had never done that job before and never did after, because of that experience, ever considered taking customer service representative job again. But they were timing you, they were listening into your calls randomly, they would call people into the office and summarily fire them. So they kind of created a fearful environment, a stressful environment for people. I was young, I was still living at home, I was in going to community college, trying to figure out what I wanted to do to get myself. I always knew I wanted to be, wouldn't even say I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I always knew I wanted to go to law school. It was a dream of mine since I was probably 10 or 11 years old to go to law school. And so I was still figuring that stuff out. But I took this job. It was a part-time job, but I was working close to full-time hours, but they had us work just enough for it to not be a full-time job, so they didn't have to give us benefits, right? And I remember being so stressed out. And then they also let you know when they hired me, one of the things they told me was that I wasn't allowed to call in for any reason while I was on probation. And my probationary period, I think, was like 3 months or something like that. But that if you called in for any reason, you couldn't take vacation, anything like that, or you could be fired. And then people would tell you things like if you went to the bathroom and you were there too long, someone would tell you you might get in trouble because such and such watches to see how long people are in the bathroom. So the whole environment was very stressful. And I was so stressed that I started having stomach aches. I got sick. My mom was a nurse. My mom made me stay home. And I called in and said I was sick and I wasn't going to be able to come to work. And I was so upset about it. Even though I wasn't feeling well, I kept saying, I'm going to get fired. I really need to go to work. I could lose my job. This is really bad. What if they fire me? And I kind of got hysterical and started crying and saying I'm going to lose my job and my job and my job. And my mom came in my room and she sat in my room and she told me, this is ridiculous. You live at home. I always remember her saying this to me. You live at home. You don't have chick nor child. Quit that job. It is causing you too much stress. Quit that job. And don't ever let a job cause you this kind of stress. I want you to quit that job. I want you to quit that job right now. And I called on the spot and I quit that job. And I never went back. And I learned something from that experience. And I had to go find another job because everyone in my house, when I was growing up, you had to have a job. If you wanted to have things, my parents kept a roof over our heads, made sure we were never hungry. But you wanted, anything besides the basics, you had to get it yourself. And so I was always motivated to have a job. I often had more than one job. I would have two part-time jobs. So I found another job. And I ended up finding a much better job than that job. But that was my first experience with just up and quitting a job, no notice, no anything, which I had always thought was a horrible thing to do. But my mother was very adamant in that moment that I quit that job, so I did. But many years later, I was working in another environment. This time was a hospital, major hospital in the DC area. And I was in my 20s, still in my 20s. This was a couple of years after what happened in South Florida. I left and I moved to the DC area. And I was working at a hospital. There are lots of hospitals in the DMV, lots of major hospitals. And I was working in like an administrative side of the hospital. So not in the hospital itself. But again, toxic work environment. And in this particular environment, it was more... when I just got there, it was more problematic for me because I was watching other people be mistreated. Not that I was being mistreated myself. My boss, the person who hired me, was a very nice lady, white woman. She's a very nice woman, but she didn't stay very long because of in a lot of ways because of the work environment. And one of the things was that she hired me. And I may have mentioned this in another time when I was telling a little story. Because as I talk to people on discovery calls, I hear the fear. We have really been conditioned that the worst thing that could ever happen to us is to not have a job. That we must be on the plantation, especially us black folk. That we must be on the plantation and stay on the plantation. And if we're going to leave the plantation, it must be for another plantation. Okay? And this is very harmful belief system, but it has been conditioned into us and beaten into us, frankly. And over, hundreds of years, we are all, black people in the United States of America, we are all descendants of slavery, whether we are descendants of slaves in the United States of America or we're descendants of slaves from in the Caribbean. Unless we came to the United States directly from Africa recently, we got here and slavery is somewhere in our ancestry, right? And so I recognize that a lot of these things are conditioning from slavery, whether it's slavery as experienced in the United States or slavery elsewhere. My ancestors were slaves in the Caribbean. And, I heard a lot of things as a child about what it was, because a lot of information was passed verbally. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, used to often talk about the fact that we were African, and that, where we descended from. He knew what our tribe was, that where we descended from, and he would always tell me that I was Igbo. I didn't understand what he was telling me when I was a child. I would listen to him say these things and sometimes think that it was silly that he was saying it to me. But he wanted me to know who I was, and he wanted me to know where I came from. And of course, later I understood that Igbo is Nigeria and it's West Africa. But I digress. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have all been conditioned to put ourselves in environments and stay in environments that are harmful to us. And to decide not to do that it requires reconditioning, right? It requires going against what you've been actually taught. And it's something that I, was lucky enough to learn because I had a parent that modeled it for me, but I recognize most people don't have that. And so, I was in this environment and I saw people being mistreated, but my boss was nice to me, and she tried to explain to me what I was seeing, because I was in an environment where there was a black woman who reported to my boss's boss, and she really mistreated her staff, who were predominantly black. And while I didn't work for her, I was privy to what was going on. I had to go to staff meetings. One of the things that my boss made me do was go to the staff meetings and take notes, because she didn't want to go. And she was, this woman's boss's executive assistant, and she hired me to be her assistant, right? And she didn't want to go to the meeting, so she made me go to the meeting. So I would go to these meetings and watch this black woman yell and scream at, 20 plus people in a room. Sometimes you would see the saliva draining on the side of her mouth, because she would clench her teeth when she was speaking. And she would be so nasty in the way that she spoke to them. And it was the first time I had ever seen someone treat people that way. And they were mostly all terrified of her. And she was pretty awful to them. And she oversaw, billing. She made sure that the money was collected for a certain part of the hospital. And apparently she was very good at it. So nobody cared about how she treated the staff. And of course, the staff were all black. But I was very bothered about it, and I would talk to my manager about it, and she would tell me, she will talk to her boss, but that there wasn't really anything else that she could do, and that I didn't need to worry about it, because I didn't work for this lady, and she didn't really have anything to do with my day-to-day. But I would hear her yelling down the hallway sometimes, and I was always, marked by the fact that the woman who was in charge, who was a white woman, who was her boss, who was indirectly my boss, who was my boss's boss, her office sat in between my boss's office and the end of the hall where this other woman sat. So of course she could also hear when this woman was yelling and whatever. But she never said anything about it. She always acted like she was completely unaware, right? Blithely unaware. She came into the office late, left early. She didn't really have to worry about things, because this woman was dealing with everything and making sure the money came in. And she didn't seem to care how the sausage got made, as long as it got made and it sold and made money. So she was perfectly okay to have this black woman as the overseer, cracking the whip on these other people who worked for her. And everything, I was aware of what was going on, but it was when my boss left and a new person came in that my life became more difficult, because this person didn't like me. And I think from the time she met me, she didn't like me, and she kind of wanted to have her own person. And she had now inherited this black girl, right? It was a white woman, another white woman. And so one white woman was perfectly fine and perfectly nice. And then another one came in and didn't like me on site. And I didn't like her on site. So neither one of us really liked each other. And I remember her calling me into her office and berating me, and actually raising her voice at me, because she overheard me saying something to another girl that I was friends with, who sat in the cubicle next to me, about this woman down the hallway, because she had done one of the things where she was yelling and screaming at people. And I was expressing to the girl how much I disliked the way that she talked to people. And this woman called me into her office and berated me and basically said that I had no right to have an opinion about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very upset about it because I didn't take kindly to anybody raising their voice at me. And I went home and I thought about it. It was a Thursday. And I remember calling my mom and talking to my mom about it because I was very upset about it. And because I already was unhappy in the job because of the environment. And so I remember saying to my mom, I don't think I want to work there. And my mother was like, if you don't want to work there, you should leave. And I was like, you're absolutely right. And I was like, at the time, again, I was now on my own. So I had to figure out, if I leave, how am I going to, pay for my things and what am I going to do? But I thought to myself, I had gotten this job. Before I had gotten the job, I'd been working as a temp. And I was like, I can just go back to temping until I find another full-time job. And working as a temp, I can take multiple assignments. I can work as a temp, but I don't want to work at this place anymore. And the next day, I went into the office and I sat down and I typed a letter of resignation. And in that letter, I told that woman everything that I thought of her, everything that I thought of the company and the way that the hospital allowed, these Black employees to be treated. And then I put the letter, she was not in that day. She had taken that day off. I put the letter in an envelope, put her name on it, and put it right on her computer keyboard. And then I packed up my desk and I went home and I never came back. And I remember my friend who sat in the cubicle next to me telling me that Monday morning when she came into the office, and I, normally I would be in the office before her, but she came in and I wasn't there. And she went into her office and she said she came out and the woman's face was beet red when she came out of her office because I guess she got to read my letter. And when I went to the HR to collect my last paycheck, I remember the lady from HR, because she had interviewed me for the job, asking me she told me she had read my letter of resignation and she wanted to know if I wanted to revise it or change anything before it went into my file. And I told her no, I wanted to go in there exactly as I wrote it. And I told her I have absolutely no intentions of ever working for this hospital again. And I meant everything that I said in that letter. And I wanted to go into my file so that whoever ever looks at my file will see it there. And I took my paycheck and I left and never gave them another thought until I recently had a conversation with someone about quitting and the fact that you don't have to give anyone notice. You're an employee at will. You do not have to give an employer notice, especially if you feel that the way you have been treated by the employer does not warrant you giving them any notice. Now, am I recommending that everybody just up and quit their job without any notice? No. I think you always have to be strategic about what you do. But in my case, I thought it out. It didn't take me long to think it out, but I thought it out. I figured out what I would do for money until I found a new full-time job with benefits. And I decided that I did not want to work at that place not one more day. And so I quit. And I gave them a letter of resignation, but I did not provide any 2 weeks notice because I didn't feel obligated to do so. But the reason I was able to do that was that I understood that quitting that job was not going to be the worst thing that could ever happen to me, but staying there might be, right? Because it was having an impact on me, observing and watching the way people were being mistreated. And I've never forgotten that job for my entire life. I've never forgotten that woman. I've never forgotten how she was able to treat people. I've never forgotten how all the white people stood around and let her do it. And so I really want you guys to take away from what I'm saying is sometimes quitting is the best thing, right? And sometimes being fired is not the worst thing. The one time I was fired from a job was one of the best experiences of my life. Now, the actual experience of being fired wasn't a great experience, right? Being blindsided, being called in and told that you're not going to have a job wasn't a great experience. But the thing was, again, I was in an environment where I was the most senior person. I think I was the highest paid person at the time in the organization. It was a small nonprofit filled with incompetent white men, very incompetent, mediocre white men who had founded a nonprofit but they had no clue about how to run it, which was why I was there in the first place. And so by the time that I was fired from the job, I was already looking for another job. I was very unhappy there. But at the time, I was a single parent, and I was like, I can't quit without finding another job. I got to find another job because I got to have health insurance, because I got a kid and I got to have health insurance. My kid has health insurance. So I was looking for another job. So I remember when I got called in and I got fired. And let me explain how incompetent and mediocre these white men were. We had to do a layoff maybe a couple months before I was terminated. And I had to basically coach them about how to do a layoff. I had to coach them on what to say to the employees. I had to coach them on like paying people severance, everything that had anything to do with it. They had no clue. And I wrote a script for the president to use because he wanted to talk to certain people and give them the news himself. So I had to write him a script for him to know what to say, and then let him practice it with me because he didn't know how to even have this kind of communication. Do you know that clown used the script that I wrote for him to terminate me? So he read back to me words that I had written for him to use with other people to terminate me. Yes, that's how dumb they were. He couldn't even write his own script. But anyway, I remember walking out of that office, going into my office to pack up my things, walking out, getting on the elevator, and actually smiling. And while I was pissed, by the time I got to my car, I was pissed at the audacity that they would fire me, right? And these fools fired me and didn't even know how to get into their own payroll system, how to get into some other systems. They had to then call me the next day to ask me how to get into the payroll system because their payroll hadn't been done. And guess who did payroll? Me. So I had leverage and I used it, right? I think I told this story to you guys before about leverage, and I used it to negotiate a very nice exit package for myself so that I did not have to worry about even looking for a job for several months after I left that job. Let's just say I had a very nice parachute when I left there, and it turned out to be one of the most wonderful experiences being unemployed. I got to not work right through the Christmas holiday, what happened before Thanksgiving. I got to be off, spend quality time with my kid. I started working out in the gym. I lost weight. I looked great. I just was very well rested. People would see me and tell me how wonderful I looked, and they couldn't believe how I was so calm and happy and unemployed. Being unemployed, that only time being unemployed without expecting to be unemployed was actually one of the happiest 3 to 4 month periods of my adult life, up until I was able to permanently escape the plantation. Now is probably the happiest time of my adult life. But before this time, the last 4 years have been probably the happiest I've ever been in my life. But before that, I always would think about those 4 months that I didn't work for 4 months. And while I wasn't working, I wasn't worried about money because I had negotiated a very good package because I understood the leverage I had and I used it. And so even though I was fired, it turned out to be a very, very good experience for me. And so what I want to convey in this video is, don't let being fired be the thing that scares you. Instead, make sure you think through what would you do if you got fired? Have you positioned yourself in such a way that you would be able to take care of yourself if you got fired? And do you have leverage that you can use if you got fired, right? So that you could still negotiate what you needed out of that employer if they were to fire you. And if you feel so miserable in a job that you want to leave, don't wait for them to fire you. You make the decision for yourself and you leave. And if you feel that they are discriminating against you, that's your leverage to leave and to get them, in many cases, to pay you to go. But don't let being fired or being unemployed tie you to a job that is harming you. And a lot of you are literally like wrapping your arms and legs around employers that treat you like crap and don't respect you, people that don't respect you, don't care anything about you, and openly show you that they don't have any regard or respect for you, and you're afraid to leave because you act as if this is the only plantation you can ever be on. There will always be another plantation until you finally decide you don't want to be on the plantation. So I hope that what I have conveyed in this video, I hope if somebody needs to hear it, that they hear it, that being fired is not the worst thing that could ever happen to you. And it is okay to quit a job. And it is okay to quit a job and don't give them any notice if that is what you feel like you need to do. What is not okay is to stay and be miserable. So whoever needs to hear me say this, I hope this little story time has been useful and has been helpful. But don't stay in a job that you hate. And don't let being fired be the reason that you stay in a job that you hate. Okay? Hope this is helpful. As always, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this story time, please hit the subscribe button, like, comment, share this video with anybody that you think needs to see it. And of course, comment, but comment constructively. Okay? And as always, always remember, HR is not your enemy, but they're definitely not your friend. But I am. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.